Well, colleagues, welcome to our seminar on understanding diverse families' shared reading practices. I'm Teresa Kremen from the Open University, and I hope you can see my colleague Natalia Kersakova. Do you want to wave, Natalia, so everybody can see who you are? We're very glad for you to join us today. We're expecting around 100 colleagues from quite international, actually. We've got colleagues here, I know, from Prague, from Sweden, from Scotland, from Wales, and indeed from Germany. And they're all really interested, as we are, in this particular focus on shared reading practices in homes and trying to understand them from an insider's point of view, a researcher's point of view, who inhabits those spaces and learns more about what we don't know, because we don't go there unless we're in that privileged position which Rachel has been through applying for funding resources to research that. So my brief today is simply to welcome you all and to welcome Rachel. Rachel Levy is Associate Professor at the IOE, UCL, and has been there since February 2019. Before that, for many years, she was at the University of Sheffield. And she's always been interested. In fact, Rachel and Natalia and I and a group of colleagues from the OU who spent some part of lockdown dialoguing around children's perceptions, particularly of reading aloud. We were very interested in a research project on that. But she's also interested in the factors that influence motivation, engagement, and of course in children's perceptions that are influenced and shaped by their life practices in homes and their communities. Rachel is a member of the ESRC Peer Review College. Until recently, she was also editor of the UK Literacy Association mini book series. She's had a recent book out, which I know she'll share more with us, and that just came out earlier this year with a book launch. So lots to share, lots to learn. We're here under the aegis of the Centre for Literacy and Social Justice, and this is our fourth seminar. We're very glad for those of you who've come for the fourth time, and for those who've come for the first, then please do look out. We try to do at least 2 external seminars a year and then some internal seminars for our members, as well as internal meetings. We also have associate members right across the world, 36 associate members who are part of our commitment to trying to advance increased equity in education for our young people. So I'm not going to expand too long on welcoming everyone, but I did want to just say when we move to breakouts, we'll be inviting colleagues from the centre, but also other colleagues to chair small groups when we move to that for 4:10 after we've had a tea break, so that we can bring back to Rachel our thoughts and our questions. She's obviously framing some questions for us. But I thought it was worth saying that now. So if you do end up in a breakout with colleagues you don't know, take the opportunity to say hello, share what you do, and then perhaps one of you can step up and say, well, I'll feed back at the end when we come together at 4:40. So with no more ado, I'd like to hand over to Rachel. You're very welcome here. Rachel, you did such a splendid seminar. I think it was 2018 at the OU's Centre in London, in Camden. That was so well known and so well viewed that we persuaded you, thank you very much, to put it on the Open University's Reading for Pleasure website, where I believe it has had zillions of hits. So I'm looking forward to today very much indeed. I know you've moved the work on, you've learnt more, and you're here to share that with us. Thank you.
So thank you very, very much for that lovely introduction. It's an absolute pleasure to be here today. I've been trying to keep an eye on some of the names that have been popping up on the screen as I see you coming in. So I know there's lots of you out there. As always, and I've said this now for the best part of 2 years, it's always really sad that I can't see you all in person, but I'm hoping that that day is going to come quite soon. So you're all very welcome. So it was very kind of Teresa to talk about the previous presentation I had done. And if you are familiar with that presentation, you may recognise 1 or 2 of the slides, which I think still work really well. But as Teresa was saying, this is a study that has moved on. I do now have it published in a book, which always makes me feel a little bit like Graham Norton, or on the Graham Norton show, when I sort of mention the fact that there is a book that's coming out as a result of this. But it has been a labour of love. It's been a long study, and it's one of those studies that I feel that as time goes by, I'm just still asking myself more and more questions about this. So there's lots more still to do. However, one of the things that I think I probably did mention when I did the presentation a few years back was my the justification, the motivation's a better word, what brought me to this particular study, which is to understand shared reading practices in families. And again, that in itself was a bit of an evolution. When I first put the study forward and got funding for this, I have to say I always knew that I was fascinated by shared reading practices in families. But, I kind of assumed this was probably because I loved reading with my own children, and my own children loved being read to. In fact, they were read to for years. At the age of almost, 24, I think my eldest son would still be read to if if it felt socially acceptable. But it wasn't really until I was very heavily embedded in the study and was starting to look at some of the families and starting to reflect on the parents themselves and their own relationships with reading, that it made me start to think about when I was read to as a child, because I was read to and I loved being read to. But when I look back, one of the things that now kind of takes me by surprise a little bit is the fact that my mum herself, who was the one who did the reading, was not a reader. It was a very, very working class family. We had very few books in the family. My mum enjoyed reading to herself in later life, but at that particular time, she didn't read for pleasure for herself at all. In fact, very little reading really took place in that respect. And it really made me reflect back on why did she choose to read to me? These are questions that I can't ask her now because she's no longer around. But why did she read to me? And I think that's one of the things that really kind of stimulated my interest in understanding the complexity of family life and its connections with shared reading practices. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So one of the immediate questions that we're faced with is, well, what exactly is shared reading? There are a number of different definitions in the literature, but to put it bluntly, we basically think of two main definitions for shared reading, or two kinds of reading. The first being the reading to a child, with a child, and that's really what I was talking about just now in terms of my own experiences, or listening to children read. And that's often more focused on children's reading scheme texts, school books, that kind of thing. That is not really what I'm talking about here. Now, obviously, there is some degree of overlap between the two, but what I'm focused on really in this study is the reading to a child, reading with a child. Can I have the next slide, please? So one of the first questions that comes to mind, and this was really one of the questions that that was at the heart of the study, that kind of led the study, was, well, why is it good to read with young children? And there's many reasons, but I'm sure some of you are familiar with work like this, the Logan et al. Study on the million-word gap. We know that actually, if you read with young children, they just hear many, many more words. So, for example, what the study found was that if children are never read to, then they hear roughly about 4,662 words a year. I don't know who counted all these words. And if they're read to a couple of times a week, then they'll have heard that shoots up to 63,000 words. If they're read to daily, they'll have heard 296,000 words. However, if they're read about 5 books a day, that's quite a lot of books, then they'll have heard 1.5 million words by the age of 5. Next slide, please. So studies like that tell us that one of the reasons why it's good to read to young children is that they hear words, and therefore that has an impact on their ability to use language, to learn to talk. However, when I'm talking about the role of talk in shared reading, I'm actually talking about something that's a little bit more complex than that, because this isn't just about children hearing words. The shared reading experience between an adult and a child, very often the parent and the child, is something much more reciprocal. So what I will demonstrate in this study, and this is where it really kind of feeds into the rationale for conducting the shared reading project, was really about understanding why families will choose to read with their children and understanding the relationships. If I can just go on to the next slide, please. So it was taken very much from the premise that shared reading is relational. So one of the things that I found I had to do when I started writing this study up into a book was I had to think of a definition for shared reading. What, on the basis of my work, did I mean by this term shared reading? So this is the definition that I've come up with, which I just want to deconstruct ever so slightly. So I have said that shared reading is a literary event or family practice where a text is central in the joint production of meaning between people. So just to unpick that ever so slightly, even just by referring to it as an event or a practice is in itself important, because it could be a one-off event, or it could be part of the everydayness of family practice, which I will talk about. Where the text is central. Well, what did I mean by text? Could it be a book? Yes, absolutely. Very often the text is a book, but not always. Some of the families told me, sometimes in the context of talking about shared reading, they talked about thinking about their own experience as a child. I remember somebody saying, well, my parents didn't read to me, but I do remember us getting under a blanket together and watching a thunderstorm, the thunderstorm being the text. So yes, we're often talking about books, but certainly not always. And then this idea of there being a joint production of meaning, something that's happening between the parent, if it is a parent or grandparent, and the child. So in order to investigate shared reading in families, I became aware that actually what I needed to understand was a lot to do with relationships between the readers, but also the relationships between the two readers, parent, child, and their goals, their purposes, their motivations for shared reading, what they wanted to get out of it and why they would do it. Next slide, please. So having got to this point now of coming to the conclusion that shared reading is good for children, good for families, it stands to reason, does it not, that as educators, we want families to read with their children. It is good for children, it is good for their language. And it's not surprising to think that there have been a number of reading interventions that have taken place. But these reading interventions often don't work. So here's a quote from Justice et al. I'll just read it because I think it says it better than I can. But it is most certainly true that implementation of shared reading interventions by caregivers within the home environment does not always reach the levels intended by the intervention developers. So this is important. Very often, shared reading interventions don't work. And the question obviously there is why. And if I could come to the next slide, please. So one of the things that I guess I would say that I found from this study was perhaps something that in retrospect answered that question. And I would argue very strongly that perhaps one of the reasons why many reading interventions don't work is because things are happening, I would argue, the wrong way around. Very often these reading interventions are created and there's something that is done to the family. We have this intervention, we're going to support you in reading with your child, this is what you want to do. And yet what I found was that actually there's a need to begin with the family. There was a need to start with understanding shared reading, understanding how these families read, why they read, the things that encourage them, the things that discourage them, and so forth. And on the basis of that, we have to think about reading intervention, if it is even an intervention. Next slide, please. So what I was trying to achieve in this study, and I should say that this was a study that I conducted with other people. Mel Hall, for example, was a research assistant who worked with me on the study and has written the book with me. So what did we aim for in this study? Well, what we wanted to know was in some ways, what does shared reading look like? Would I recognise it? What's it like in a variety of families? And really important that we worked with families from a mixed social, cultural backgrounds. So we didn't just want to work with middle-class families. We wanted to explore the motivators and the barriers to shared reading. Now, again, this was in itself was a bit of an evolution. When I first started the study, I was thinking very much about, you know, as I've just said, the very kind of educational discourse. It's good for parents to read with their children. What prevents them from reading with their children? They were the kind of questions in my mind. But what I realised quite quickly, once we started talking to families, is that that's way too simplistic. It's not just about understanding why they do or don't read with their children. It's about understanding what shared reading is, what encourages them, what motivates them. And then on the basis of that, understanding, you know, motivators and barriers. And very much embedded within all of that is this idea of understanding how shared reading was integrated within the context of everyday family life. And that in itself was really critical. Next slide, please. So just to give you just a little snapshot of the overall research design, as I've just said, this was part of a much bigger project. There was actually 8 studies in the whole project, very multidisciplinary, drawing on fields of psychology, linguistics, education, and so forth. And most of the other projects were focused in one way or another on how shared reading promotes language development. But my study was doing something a little bit different. It was the only big qualitative study in the overall project. And mine was to, as I've just said, was to understand shared reading. So in my study, where I worked with 29 families, all with preschool children, meaning the children were aged between 3 and 4. We recruited from, so we had 20 low-income families from Sheffield and 9 from Liverpool. And recruitment was done through all kinds of different avenues, but including things like nurseries and toddler groups. Next slide, please. So it was very important when we thought about the actual interviews themselves. I think it's worth just a mention slightly, to talk slightly about this as well. But the whole premise of this study was to understand, was to talk to families. And that meant that, first of all, we had to, we interviewed in participants' homes, so we went to them. And I have to say, we didn't even talk about the word reading at first. We started off from trying to understand them, their children, family life. So we might have started off asking questions like, you know, can you tell me what a typical day looks like? What do you like doing with your child at home? What do you both enjoy? And then we sort of folded in questions about home reading, shared reading practices. We also asked the parents to talk about their own experiences of shared reading, as in them being read to as children or not. And we wanted also just to understand how this all related to their whole kind of relationship with reading and any links that might have had with shared reading. And I will talk about that as well. Next slide, please. So what I'm going to do for the remainder of the session is to give you some of the overall findings from the study. And these can probably be broadly categorized as your 3 main findings. And somewhat neatly, each of these findings is also attached to a paper. So I've got the reference for the paper under each heading as well. But essentially, I'm going to talk now about the role of enjoyment and feedback, the link with the parent's own relationship with reading, and reading as an everyday family practice. I'm assuming that everybody can hear me okay and that it's all clear. If you do need me to slow down or, you know, talk less quickly, whatever, then please just send me a message and I'll endeavour to do that.
Thanks, Rachel.
Thanks, Rachel. Okay. Next slide, please. Okay, so to start off with the role of enjoyment and feedback. So this was very much looking at that relationship between enjoyment, and that's talking about parents' enjoyment as well as the children's enjoyment, and how that was related to the feedback that parents were getting. So if I can go on to the next slide, I'll just take you through some of this. So we found out all kinds of things, as you can imagine, when it came to how shared reading was operating within these homes. And one of the things we found was that for many of these families, the reading itself was very often initiated by the children. It was something that the children would lead, and that parents were very happy to be led by the children. So here are just some comments. I've got little slices of data dotted throughout, but parents would say things like, well, she takes the books out and she'll just say to me to read, but if I take them out, she's not interested. But also in terms of the way that the shared reading would take place. This is one father who's said to us, well, I'm trying to read it all from start to finish, but that's the child, doesn't like it. You know, certain pages he just boycotts and skips it. Or another parent said, yeah, well, they started it, they got the ball rolling, saying, oh, can you read this to me? Not like the other way around. So this was something we came up against a lot, was the fact that very often it was the children who initiated the shared reading practices. Next slide, please. In addition to that, we also found that for many of these families, they were very happy just to make reading their own. So this, I think, was quite different to, if you remember the pictures I put up at the very beginning, about the difference between reading to with a child, or reading perhaps a child reading, as in reading their reading scheme book, which this kind of thing would not be allowed in that context. That was very much about reading the words and getting them right. But shared reading at this point seemed to be very much about the families reading in the way that suited them. And here are just some examples. If I just go randomly, once upon a time, there was a little boy, then my daughter will finish. And then the next thing, we've created a story. It's turned into an activity. Or another parent, I used to just make up my own thing and finish it off, and then they've all lived happily ever after. Or even when I've read it 100 times, I'm like, let's try and find something new on the page. And that obviously, I would imagine, would have been in relation to the pictures as well as the actual printed text. So making reading their own was very much part of this. Next slide, please. So when it comes to parents' motivation for reading, a huge finding, something that was critical, was that for many of these parents, it was very, very much about it being enjoyable. This is something they spoke about way over and above importance. So when we ask questions like, do you think it's important to do shared reading? Here's just some examples of the kind of comments we got. Not important. No, I just think, it's nice to have a story to read. Or to be honest, at the moment, importance in terms of how her reading is, how good she is. Well, no, that doesn't come into it. That's not why we do it. We do it because she enjoys it, and we'll talk a lot about this, it's something we can do together. Or she likes listening to the story. And again, this is critical. If she doesn't like listening to it, I won't read to her. So it was very much about we do it because, if you remember what I've just said, it's child initiated. They're making reading their own. It's got to be enjoyable. Or I like this one. I think both of us, and she was talking there about her and her husband, I think both of us have the same kind of end goal, which is just to make her laugh. It's another form of entertainment, get her away from the bloody TV. Next slide, please. So that's not to say that these parents didn't engage in shared reading because of concerns for literacy. Indeed, some of them did. Some of them, would say things to us like, it is a very important life skill. Because there's less time to work on it in school. So in other words, this parent was saying, well, we feel it's important to do it now because they might not be able to, focus too much on school. Or we did get him books over the summer. We didn't want him to fall behind. Or just get into the habit of reading. Because actually this was a parent, I think she was Iranian, which I see everybody reading here. So, we feel as if it's the right thing to do. So yes, absolutely, that did feature within some of their motivations. Next slide, please. But enjoyment was absolutely key. And parents spoke very much about their children and the fact that their children had to enjoy it. But they also talked about their own enjoyment. I mean, I won't read all of these, but I think this quote at the bottom right really does sum it up. If I'm not going to enjoy it, if I'm not giving my 100%, she's not going to enjoy it with me. So what's the point? She would probably notice you have to be into it. And this was something that many, many parents told us in all kinds of different ways, that it had to be enjoyable. They had to enjoy it if their children were to enjoy it. And I'm not just reading, I talk more about the pictures because it makes it more interesting for me than just repeatedly reading time and time again. So again, this whole kind of focus on I've got to enjoy it as well as my child. Next slide, please. So in order for the parents to know that their children was enjoying it, they needed feedback. And this again was something that came across quite strongly. Like now, I'm happy to get her books because I can see there's something going on. Like on her face, she gets it, she enjoys it. I'm not one of those to just do it and think hopefully something's going in. Many of the parents spoke about things like the facial expression on their children laughing, snuggling up, enjoying it. So parents needed to see that feedback to know that their children were enjoying the activity and that they wanted it to continue. Next slide, please. And that brought me, when I started to really think about what was happening here, to something that I've called the cycle of reciprocity, where it seemed to be that this was very cyclical. The parent was providing positive feedback to the child during the activity. When that happened, the child was enjoying the activity more. The child was therefore providing positive feedback to the parent. Therefore, the parent was enjoying the activity more. Therefore, the parent was feeling more motivated to continue. As these parents have been saying to us, I'll carry on now because she's enjoying it. Shared reading would continue. Parents therefore providing positive feedback. They feel as if they're doing something that their child is enjoying, the child enjoys it, and so on. So this kind of cycle I noticed was really important in the maintenance of shared reading activity. Next slide, please. So one of the things that trying to sort of like start to pull this all together is that certainly for a lot of the parents, and much as we did not go into this study in any way, shape or form to try to compare parents, it did happen quite naturally that we did have some a few parents who were probably more affluent and some parents who weren't. And actually there was a difference really in how these parents spoke about the maintenance of shared reading. And I do think it's quite worth just mentioning this. So for example, Lisa, these are obviously all pseudonyms, but Lisa was saying, well, I think it's very important to read and carry on reading, and I will carry on reading critically until she asks me not to. So again, it's coming back to this idea of it being child-led. It's about when the child enjoys it. So it's just seeing her enjoying it, seeing how much her talking and her writing things is coming on, but very much about the child. Similarly, Jo told us, I think at this stage, because she likes them, talking about books, then I can enjoy it. I wouldn't do it if she didn't like it, because I couldn't be bothered. But she's so engaged with books, she does like it. Now that, I think, actually was quite different to when we take a comment like Elizabeth, for example, who told us that it's much more about, the right thing to do. I think at this stage it's really important that he starts to learn to read and write and speak, and he's starting to express an interest in actually learning to read. So we'll look at the pages and say, I don't know the words, and I'll say, well, we'll learn the words. We'll start learning them. And we've been doing like letters with him and a bit of writing and a bit of reading. So I just think it was very interesting to see what was actually quite a critical difference there. So for some of these parents, the important thing wasn't about we've got to learn the words. It was that, well, we've got to enjoy this. But if the enjoyment stopped, we might stop reading. Next slide, please. So that brings us to this idea of negative feedback. And certainly there were parents who spoke particularly about when their children were younger and how getting negative feedback actually prevented them from reading. So saying things like, well, I remember for a while she's just not interested, until she was maybe like going on 2 and, well, she didn't have an interest in books and so forth. Or this other parent, before that she just doesn't like reading. She cut the book, as a baby. Babies will do things like that. Messing about with a book, you can tell he's not interested, that kind of thing. So if I just go on to the next slide, this made us really think about reading with babies. Now we didn't actually explore this, but it kind of came to light really that for many of these parents, some of them did read with their children as very young babies, but some of them didn't. And this was because they thought they're not ready. They're not interested. because the feedback was so important. And here are just some examples. I just didn't bother reading to them as a baby. I don't know, there's no point. They don't understand, and so forth. Or I didn't think they would be, you know, interested in that kind of age. So again, just underlining that importance of that reciprocal relationship between enjoyment and feedback. Next slide, please. So just to kind of summarise this particular finding. So what we were finding here was that for many of these families, reading was highly child-led. Some parents were concerned about educational endeavour, but for many, they engaged in shared reading because of pleasure and enjoyment. This linked very much to the need for feedback. Parents wanted to see that their child was enjoying reading in order for them to begin or maintain the reading. We felt, looking back, that this does have real implications for reading with babies. And while receiving positive feedback for children was clearly important for all parents, it did make us think that this might be particularly important for some families within lower income groups. And all of this has implications for intervention. If I can come on to the next slide, please. I was just going to pause for a second here. Now, I am aware, looking at the time, that I probably will answer questions at the end. Teresa, do come in and let me know what you'd like me to do at this point. If you'd like me to answer any questions or keep going.
Well, you know, let's take a moment for folk to just make a question in the chat line if you'd like one. Emily has just asked what's the name of the book, so go for it.
Oh, right, yes, thank you. This is my Graham Norton moment, isn't it? So family literacies, I've got it here, I've got a picture at the end as well. Family literacies, reading with young children. And it's written by myself and my colleague Mel Hall. Thank you.
It's a damn good read.
Thank you. Okay, so please do pop questions in the chat. If we had, I know we've got time at the end of this to actually go into breakout groups, which is lovely. So, you know, and I'm hoping to come around some of the rooms and actually be able to talk to you, you know, and answer. And certainly at the end of this, there'll be time to kind of, you know, come back together and ask questions. So please do pop that in.
Can I just offer a question Emily also asked, which was whether you interviewed any families who didn't read at all and never really got into it, and whether they were hostile or didn't have any books in the house. In other words, she's kind of saying, what at the extreme end? Any comments on that?
Yeah. I mean, it's a really good question. That raises a big question actually about sampling, because as I'm sure you can imagine, it's much harder with a study like this to find families who do not read. Mostly we will find families who do in one way or another. However, yes, we did have a couple, and I will talk a little bit more about this in one of the other findings. Most of the families did read with their children. However, not all of the parents were readers, and quite a lot of the parents spoke about their you know, not enjoyed reading themselves at school, that kind of thing. So I will talk a little bit more about that. But we did have there was one family that does come to mind, who did say, you know, she had I think quite a lot of mental health issues. She was finding life very, very challenging, very hard. Certainly not hostile by any stretch, but talking to her about reading, it was just like, well, you know, I can barely get through the day. You know, how am I going to find time to fit this in? And actually, you know, there were things that we learned from her as well, you know, in terms about the complexity of shared reading. So that was built in.
Okay, thank you. I'll encourage you to carry on, because I know you've got another pause moment later, and we might come back to some of the other questions then.
All right, thank you. Thanks, Teresa. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to the second major finding, which was looking at the link between the parents' own relationship with reading and the shared reading that took place in their own homes. So I'll just go straight on to the next slide, please. So, like I say, one of the things that I was quite interested in doing was looking at the sample. Like I say, it was almost 30 families, and having talked to the parents about their own shared reading that they may have done with parents, or their own kind of family reading, and also their own reading as a child. Did they like reading? Did they not like reading? I then did a very kind of brutal analysis just to try to kind of understand roughly where these parents fitted into this table here, in terms of they did read with their children, but sorry, they did read themselves and did read with their children, or they did read themselves but did not read with their children. So there was only one family that came into that category, to answer one of the previous questions. But the group here that I'm going to talk about now that I think was particularly interesting was this one here on the left. Those parents who told us that they did not read with their own, they did not read themselves or didn't like reading, but actually did go on to have a very productive and enjoyable shared reading relationship with their own children. So if I can just go on to the next slide, I'll just talk a little bit more about that. So I'm just going to give you a couple of examples now. First of all, here were two participants who very much fell into that category. This is Natalie and Kylie. So to give you a little bit of background, Natalie, 28-year-old single mother, lives with her two sons, aged 3 and 8, currently at home full-time, plans to return to her job as a classroom assistant when her youngest started school. And Kylie, who lived in Liverpool with her son Bradley, who is 3 years, 10 months, her husband, who's a self-employed builder, and her 11-year-old daughter. Next slide, please. So here's just some kind of examples from the data, just to get a feel for the kind of things that they were telling us about their own relationships with reading. So Natalie, for example, I never read when I was younger, ever. I don't think it interested me. Or I've got certain memories in English. Now that means in the subject English at secondary school. Certain memories in English where I couldn't read certain words, and I used to have to ask the teacher, and obviously you don't want to have to ask the teacher in front of kids. Several of the parents talked about not enjoying English at school and being made to read aloud, that kind of thing. Kylie, Mum never sat and read with us, or I can remember reading out in class and I wasn't confident around them, that's books, and I'm still not. I don't enjoy reading, not out loud, but kids' books are fine. So I'm just going to carry on a little bit more there. Next slide, please. So when it came to talking about their own reading now, Natalie, no, I'm not a reader really. I read autobiographies. Now it's again so interesting here that this is not considered to be reading, but I think she would read things like the Katie Price autobiography, that kind of thing. I read autobiographies, but I don't really sit and read. I wouldn't go out purposely and buy a book. Or Kylie, and I just thought this is a really kind of sweet example. You know, when people go on holiday and get into a book, I just can't get into one. I think it's from not reading when I was younger. So we have these two kind of pictures developing of Natalie and Kylie, both of whom really had not had positive personal relationships with reading themselves. Next slide, please. But here's some of the things that they would tell us about their own reading relationships with their children. I'll just read this. For example, Natalie was saying, it's our little bonding time, really, that time together. Now, this is critical. It goes off books as well, but just because we've got books in our hand, we talk about the rest of the day. We get a story in. That's our time. Now, this was something that came up again a lot, that parents were telling us, but the thing is, it's not just about the books. It's not just about reading. It's about talking. It's about time. And I will talk a little bit more about that at the very end of the presentation. Again, I enjoy reading more now with the kids because I'm excited to do different things with them, thinking of things I could do with a book. And this is so lovely. And I'm learning about new authors as well. Like, it wasn't something I was interested in. So it's nice now. I look at the stories and I'm looking for more books that author's wrote that I think he might enjoy. I never used to do that. I would just have a look to see what looked good on the cover. So she's actually learning about books and about authors. I feel okay when asked about her reading now. I've picked it up more now as I've gone along. I'm more confident now with the kids than when I was younger. I think I'm good at reading now. I hope so. So again, the shared reading had clearly had a massive impact on Natalie's own reading and her own confidence in reading. Next slide, please. Kylie, again, very similar. It's so easy to read with him, easy. Again, when we think about how hard she said she'd found reading. I love reading with him. I do. I love doing things like that. Again, easy. I think it's one of the easiest things you can do because you can sit and read for half an hour or 5 minutes. It's just something you can fit in. There's no clearing up afterwards. Just put the book back and get on. You know what? You can even do it while the tea's being cooked. And again, she went on to say, just because, you know, we do it because his books are out. and you'll go and get them. When they want to read, you can't say no. So what I'm hoping that you can start to see is how all these different aspects are fitting together. The child has led it, but actually that's had a massive impact on her and her confidence with reading as well. Next slide, please. Again, I just wanted to mention one other parent. This was Hadra. Now, her experience was quite different. She married when she was 16. She was now in her early 30s, lives with her husband and 2 children, children aged 3 years and 6 months. I'll just go on to the next slide, please. Okay, so like Kylie and Natalie, Hadra spoke about the fact that she used to struggle with reading. However, unlike the other 2, she then got into reading and started to really enjoy reading as she got older, to the point that she was say things like, oh, it's a bit out of control now. You know, I had a period when I had to stop reading because sometimes I don't know, you know, there's housework that needs to be done. So she became a reader in her own right. Next slide, please. Now, the reason I mentioned this was because Hadra, not surprisingly, talked about having a good reading relationship with her child, or rather her child enjoying shared reading. But what I found really fascinating by her, about her story, was that actually it wasn't her who tended to do the shared reading, it was her husband. And her husband was actually not a reader. So she would say things like, and I've just read this one out. So this is the dad, gets her changed and reads her book, and then just tells her some stories and asks her about her day. So they talk. It's that factor again, talk. So they just talk. I wouldn't say rubbish, but they talk randomly, and he'll tell her a story and I take her up to bed. So again, here's an example of somebody who's not a reader, doesn't enjoy reading, but is actually having a really lovely, engaged, shared reading relationship with his daughter. Next slide, please. So what I'm finding here was that, as I've already alluded to, that for these parents who did not have positive reading relationships, they actually started to enjoy reading. And again, it's that, it's that theme of enjoyment coming back again. Natalie, I enjoy reading more with the kids now, learning about new authors. And Bina, and I haven't mentioned Bina up till now, but she said very similar things. I'm learning now. There's so many things, like so many stories I've read that I've never read in my life before. And also she talked culturally about not having access to these kind of stories within her own home culture, but really enjoying that doing with her child now. Next slide, please. So just to summarise the second theme. So adults who'd reported that they were not readers or didn't like reading and or had poor experiences of reading at school, they actually can and do go on to have enjoyable shared reading relationships with their children. Now, one of the questions that I was asking myself at this point is why? What is it about reading? And I'm going to talk about the fact that when we started to analyse the data in a different way and started to look at redefining what shared reading is, because I sort of came to the conclusion that it was different. It was different to the kind of reading that they'd been doing at school. So when I say the experience of reading to a child is different to their own reading, and that reading's not necessarily about reading, yes, it is a deliberately contentious term there, but what I'm trying to say here is that there were different definitions of what reading actually is, and the way in which parents read with their children seemed to own a different kind of definition of reading. For many families, reading was very much embedded in the everydayness of family life and family practice. And that's the last theme that I just want to go to now. Sorry, next slide, please. Again, I'm just going to pause at that point. I'm aware that I think we've only got another 10 minutes, is it, Teresa? I don't know if you want me to take another question now or keep going.
I'd be inclined to take another question. In fact,
okay.
There have been quite a few people commenting, and I think that's a really interesting, theme. A bit more about the concept of shared reading, which you're obviously opening up,
Sure.
And a couple of people talking about the texts. Rachel, do you want to make a comment around the text? People talking about whether any of the texts were digital, whether it was non-fiction, was it constrained to specific genres? It's a little bit more about the detail of the text, if possible.
Sure, thank you. So this was an interesting thing, actually. So we were very aware when we started the study that, like I said, that text comes in all kinds of different forms. And we were actively inviting parents to talk about digital text, iPads, and so forth. But what we found actually was that most of the parents used books. However, when we talked about where they got books from, rather than it being sort of, what we would see as being necessarily, the high quality children's literature, many parents talked about picking up books in the supermarket or having books passed down to them, that kind of thing. So it was largely books, but it was actually, they weren't, the way in which they accessed books was very different. They talked about getting books when the children were born, from Book Trust, that kind of thing, the kind of, the book gifting schemes, which again, really important, really important to see how much those books were read and reread and treasured. So yeah, not so much in terms of digital text. Some parents did talk about digital text, and certainly some parents did talk about, within the context of shared reading, enjoying watching TV programs with the children, that kind of thing. But they wanted to talk about books. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, that's fascinating. Do carry on, and then perhaps we'll have some more at the end. I'm sure there'll be a discussion around this.
I'm sure there will be. Thank you. Okay, so I'll just carry on to the next slide, please. And thank you so much for all your engagement. That's really lovely. So the final finding that I want to talk about is one of the things that that was really evident and became more and more evident as we progressed through the data collection was the fact that for these families, reading was very much part of everyday family practice. And if I could just go on to the next slide, I'll explain what I mean by that. So we've already talked about a couple of families, Natalie, Kylie and Hadra, who spoke about things like, it's our bonding time, that time together. It goes off books. Just because we've got books in our hand, we talk about the rest of the day. So we very much came to understand that for some of these families, things like the bedtime story did exist, but critically not for everyone. Sometimes families would talk about, they would read with their younger child in the afternoon when older children were at school or something. But again, it being part of everyday family practice. Like Kylie, who said that it was an easy thing to do, and who should find ways of, I wouldn't even necessarily say building it in. It was more the fact that it just kind of emerged as part of everyday practice when the tea's getting cooked. And Hadra obviously spoke about it, building it in. If I could go on to the next slide, I'll just progress that a little bit further. So one of the things that we were finding was that for many of these families, they used shared reading because it helped them to create family routines. Say, for example, one of the parents said, well, we only incorporated it into a routine so she would know bath, book, bed, and it helped her to identify bedtime. So this was something that shared reading was doing for the families. I don't think anyone would sleep if we didn't have books. We need them. We need to have this story because it signals bedtime, that kind of thing. So there was quite a lot of data to suggest that families used shared reading in that way. But another thing that we found, and again, I was very grateful to my colleague Mel Hall, because she brought in some literature about family display that actually was really, really significant and really helpful to the study. But it meant that looking at the data, again, from the point of view of shared reading being something that families would do because it actually, it presents them as doing a family activity. I'm just going to give you one example that might illustrate that a little bit more clearly than I've just said. So here was one example of somebody who was separated from her child's father, and she had a new boyfriend. And she talked about the fact that the new boyfriend often did the reading. So let me just read this. Most of the time it's my boyfriend who does the reading. He's much better, and she laughs more when he does it. He's got better voices. She would like 10 books, and it's like, right, let's go. She's excited. She loves it. Now, this is the critical part here. I think as well, her dad doesn't do anything like that. So she looks at Jamie as, well, I don't want to say his dad, but he looks at her as his own daughter. So I think what this parent was saying was that the shared reading symbolises an aspect of saying we are family. So that ties in very closely, I think, with the literature on family display and the ways in which families may use certain activities or whatever to display their family life. Can I go on to the next slide, please? I keep forgetting it won't just move. So as I come to the final part of the presentation, trying to pull all this together. Now, I've mentioned several times that in analysing the data and trying to understand what is it about shared reading, what is it in these families, and how is it different from other kinds of reading or indeed other kinds of activity. I came up with this notion. I know this sounds cheesy, so do forgive me for that, but I like it. What I've called the 4 T's. So as I've said, one of the major aims of the study was to understand what shared reading actually looked like. So this concept of the 4 T's for me was very helpful, and I'll explain what I mean by that. It's a bit cryptic, I know. If I could go on to the next slide, please. So as we've already mentioned, text was symbolic within the shared reading. Many of the parents used a text, and as I've already said, very often this was a book, but certainly not always. But it was almost a case of it didn't matter what that text was. It could be a book. Sometimes it was a picture. Sometimes it was a thunderstorm or whatever. The important thing was that it was a catalyst, and that's what many of the parents spoke about, a catalyst to facilitate communication and also engagement with their children. And we found that parents were at this point anyway, very happy to be flexible with the texts. If you remember some of the other comments that we made, sometimes my child might boycott certain pages. You know, sometimes parents felt as if they should be reading it from start to finish, but the child didn't want to. They wanted to talk about the pictures. And for most, that was okay. So the role of text was there. If I could come on to the next slide, please. Absolutely critical was talk. I think without exception, all parents talked about shared reading being an opportunity for talk. And I think when we think about intervention and how we support families, this is something that we need to give much more thought to, I would argue. But shared reading was seen to be flexible. It was open-ended, it was free. And because of that, it crucially had a place for talk. Again, I don't know if you remember, but like the parent who said things like, well, just because we've got a book in our hand, we talk about the day. That was valued. And I think that was one of the things that was so important, was that actually that kind of valuing that time to be with my child and to talk. As I've said, the talk may have been focused on a text, but parents used shared reading as an opportunity just to talk about anything. Parents also talked about it as a chance for the child just to hear their voice. And particularly with younger children, some parents talked about things like soothing their child. If the child was tired or unwell, sometimes the child might just want to lie there and listen to their parent talking. But the talk, absolutely critical. Next slide, please. And coupled with that, and I hope you can start to see how these things are highly, highly interrelated, but it was having time. Very often the shared reading meant that parents had protected time. And as I've just said, they really valued that time to spend with their children. For some, this might have been associated with a routine. It's bedtime, we've got that time together at the end of the day. But for others, it could have happened at any time of the day, like the afternoon or whatever, or when tea's getting cooked or whatever. Whatever it was for the family, they often used words like it's his time, it's her time, it's our time. So time was critical. And if I just come to the last T, and a bit of poetic license here, but I've called this togetherness. It's about having that time to bond, to be close, to be intimate, and having that kind of connection. So again, when we looked at the data, it was really quite, well, I find it fascinating, obviously, but we found it's such a highly sensory experience. Parents would often talk about the senses in connection with the time that they had with their child. The physicalness, talk about being dead cuddle or snuggling in. Hearing each other, intently listening, or we chat about what's happening in the pictures. Sight, seeing each other. Look at his facial expressions. You can see him taking it in. Or even scent, he's all bathed and fresh and I can get into bed with him. So this real sense of shared reading being this togetherness, this time for, to spend with their child together. If I can come on to the next slide. So this is the last slide. So trying to pull all this together and to thinking about what we mean by intervention. And like I say, this probably would be another interesting topic for discussion, whether they're even, we even want to use the word, intervention. But I would argue that as we start to think about the implications of this study, firstly, rather than intervention encouraging families to do shared reading, which they very often do, we need to understand how shared reading is part of doing family. We need to recognise that for many families, shared reading carries a different definition of reading to perhaps other definitions of reading. And within that, there's a need to encourage parents critically to find ways of enjoying shared reading if they don't, and I think, this is so important, but valuing that enjoyment. It's okay to enjoy shared reading. And that might sound silly, but when we think about what might be happening to children as they start school and they come home with a reading scheme book, and then it becomes much more kind of serious, to be able to say to families, carry on reading, carry on enjoying reading. That's good, that's a good thing, and that has benefits. And carry on doing things in ways that suit you and suit your family, suit your child. And I think that's brought me to the end. Thank you very much for listening, and really looking forward to seeing all your questions. Thank you. Oh, there's my book. I forgot to say that. There's the book.
There's the book.